wheels when I could be out there on the streets or wherever trying to prevent these deadly invasions. That's what was going on in my mind. So I opened a little file in 9/11 and started putting anomalies into it, but I didn't do anything very serious about it. Now, when I reflect on this now, do I blame myself? Do I think I went off base there? Well, yeah, I do actually. How did I know that it would be difficult to figure out that the official narrative was wrong? I mean, admittedly, it is difficult to figure out who exactly did it, what their names were and all the details of what they did. But it doesn't actually take long at all to figure out that the official narrative is rotten from stem to stern. So let me recommend to those of you in the peace movement who haven't done it yet to look at your busy calendar, and I'm not being cynical, I'm sure it's busy just like mine was, and block out 2 days. And buy, let's say, David Ray Griffin's 2 books, The New Pearl Harbor and The New Pearl Harbor Revisited, and hide somewhere, right, for 2 days and read them. And then you can have a discussion with us. And if you still think we're all wrong, fine, I'll leave you alone. But if you haven't taken those 2 days, then I don't have much sympathy. Okay, I think that there were actually 3 main mistakes that I made in my thinking at that time. The first is the one I just told you. How the heck did I know it was going to be complicated? Invest a little time and look. The second mistake is that I didn't pay enough attention to the process of the construction of the official story and the process of figuring out what the response to the events was going to be. And here's a weird one. Like a lot of dissidents, I have contempt for a lot that's on television, and especially television quote-unquote news. Therefore, I don't watch it. This was a big mistake in this case. Let me tell you a time when television is invaluable. It's when a breaking story is being covered. The day of, even the day after. All kinds of stuff will find its way onto television, which will later be swept down the memory hole. Watch it. Watch it like a freaking fanatic. Take notes. Record it. It's invaluable. And I didn't do that. In fact, I emotionally couldn't bear it. I came home, I watched a plane crash into the Trade Center, and I said, I just felt sick. I don't like watching mass murder. I said, I cannot watch this. I didn't watch anything more. I understand my feelings, but the result was I didn't even see those bloody towers collapse for years. If I had, it might have helped. I want to give you a few examples of how it would have helped if I'd watched same-day coverage. Let me take CNN as an example here, although I could take lots of other networks. By the end, recently I've watched the 15.5 hours same-day coverage of 9/11 on CNN. Watched it twice. Surprised to find that by the end of that day, the journalists are accepting the following as true. 1, Osama bin Laden and his group did it. 2, the deed should be understood as an act of war. By the way, not obvious at all. Most people in the world, as we know from polls, thought it should be understood as a crime. No, it's an act of war. 3rd, it's an act of war. We need to respond with an act of war. Also not obvious. Next, states that support terrorist action are no different from the terrorists themselves and should be treated accordingly. Sounds reasonable. According to that principle, the government of Nicaragua could have legally bombed Washington when they were attacked by the Contras. And obviously then the conclusion is Osama bin Laden made these attacks from Afghanistan, and therefore a military invasion of Afghanistan is on our agenda. This is all during the first day on CNN. And there's a bunch of other points, but I won't get into them. How were these? If I had been watching TV, I not only would have seen how it was put together and who was putting it together. One grumpy old white man after another was brought on there. Members of the national security cult, Alexander Haig, George Shultz, Orrin Hatch, even Dr. Strangelove himself, Henry Kissinger, live from Germany on the telephone. We must prepare to eradicate the source of this. I'm not kidding. It's almost a direct quote. Listen, the point here is there wasn't a scrap of evidence. There wasn't a single logical argument. There was nothing said during the 15.5 hours that constituted evidence that Osama bin Laden had done this act. I didn't know that because I didn't watch it. I read the paper afterwards, and I kind of assumed that there must be some sort of evidence. Well, let me tell you, there wasn't. And let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. 3:44 p.m., anchor Judy Woodruff looks solemnly into the camera and says, quote, "Sources are telling CNN's national security correspondent, David Ensor, that there are, quote, good indications that people with links to the Osama bin Laden organization are responsible for today's attacks," unquote. Sources, Judy? What sources? Good indications? Give me one. Judy Woodruff is visibly embarrassed as she says this. She apologizes. Half hour later, she gets David Ensor, the security correspondent, in front of the camera and asks him if he can be a little more specific. He says his sources naturally aren't going to give us any specifics at this time. After all, it's secret. And he's visibly excited that he is allowed to have these secrets. The most he can tell us is the sort of things they will be looking at are passenger lists and airport videos. And I wish Judy Woodruff had said at that point, "Good thinking, David, but I don't want to know what they're going to look at. I want to know what they have looked at, which has led them to Osama bin Laden, and I want to see the evidence, and I want to show it to the American people, because going to war, David, is a big fricking deal." She didn't say it. And 8 years later, CNN still seems satisfied, though we still don't have authenticated passenger lists, and we still don't have authenticated airport videos. So here's how it's supposed to work. The national security correspondent has faith in his sources. Judy is supposed to have faith in her correspondent, and we, the audience, are supposed to have faith in Judy. And it's not good enough. If I had been watching the construction of this story, I would have had a much clearer sense than I did of how pitifully weak it was. A second example, if I had watched television, has to do with the destruction of the World Trade Center. Not having watched the TV, I had the impression for some time after 9/11, and I think many people in the peace movement still do, that the official account of the demise of the Trade Center, broadly speaking structural failure due to jet impact and fire, was a kind of default position. Let me explain what I mean. The default position on something is something where you don't have to make a choice. It's kind of built in, it's obvious. By default position, I thought for some time that it was obvious to everyone on the scene, that they all thought, that they naturally thought, that they originally thought, that of course the planes had smashed into the towers, and therefore the towers fell as a result of that smashing. And I thought for some time that the people came along talking about explosions, unrelated to the jet impacts, were somehow latecomers, revisionists, giving us a thing that we would have to go out of our way to choose. And I think many people in the peace movement still think this. Some of them say, well, I'm too busy, or I'm not a scientist, or whatever, so I can't go with this exotic, late-coming hypothesis. I have to go with the obvious, natural default position. Well, it's historically false. Both of the positions that are the leading positions on the collapse, so-called, of the towers today were articulated between 10 and 10:30 a.m. That is, between the collapse of the South Tower and the collapse of the North Tower. They were the leading hypotheses then, and they still are. give you a couple of examples from CNN starting at 10:28 when the North Tower comes down. And I'm not trying